all set? We got everybody, right? Good afternoon. I apologize for the delay in beginning. We had votes on the floor. That much being said, the Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service, and the District of Columbia will now come to order. Ranking Member Mr. Chaffetz and members of the Subcommittee, good afternoon, and welcome to the Subcommittee's third business meeting of the second session of the 111th Congress. Today we convene to consider the following three bills. Firstly, the Federal Supervisor Training Act of 2010, H.R. 5522. Secondly, H.R. 5702, a bill to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to reduce the waiting period for holding special elections to fill vacancies in membership of the Council of the District of Columbia. And thirdly, H.R. 5746, the United States Postal Service's CSRS Obligation Modification Act of 2010. The first order of business will be on consideration of H.R. 5522, the Federal Supervisor Training Act of 2010. I'm pleased to support and advance H.R. 5522, which is a bipartisan bill that was introduced by Representatives Jim Moran of Virginia, Frank Wolf, and Jerry Connolly, also of Virginia. Under this legislation, federal agencies would be required to provide training programs subject to appropriations to all new supervisors within 1 year or higher or promotion. Additionally, H.R. 5522 would direct agencies to provide an ongoing training at least once every 3 years to all supervisors and to institute a mentoring program between experienced and brand new supervisors. Currently, certain agencies, including the Departments of Defense, Justice, Treasury, and Veterans Affairs, voluntarily provide supervisor training, although they are not required to do so. As we all know, such training can easily be eliminated from an agency's budget due to funding constraints, especially today. Even more alarming is that presently there are a number of executive branch agencies that provide no specific management training. It is abundantly clear that if frontline managers and supervisors are afforded leadership development training, labor management relations will improve significantly, thereby reducing the number of employees' complaints, grievances, and adverse appeals, which ultimately will save taxpayer dollars and increase worker productivity. Further, supervisory training will enhance efforts to inject performance management into the federal workforce, which is an important goal to ensure taxpayer dollars are yielding results. H.R. 5522 is supported by the Federal Managers Association, the Senior Executive Association, the Partnership for Public Service, the American Federation of Government Employees, the National Treasury Employees Union, and the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, and also the National Federation of Federal Employees. Again, I want to echo my strong support for the bill, as I believe that investing in our workforce will help to ensure a more productive, efficient, and skilled federal government for all of our citizens. I'd now like to yield to my friend, the ranking member from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to all of you. I appreciate your patience as we had votes, and thank you for that. Without question, all federal government employees, especially supervisors, should be highly skilled and trained. After all, the American people employ them and expect a return on their investment. It is also incumbent upon us to ensure that hard-earned tax dollars are not being spent frivolously, and I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing your concerns as to the training of federal supervisors before this committee. I also think it would probably be accurate to say there are significant dollars associated with training and re-educating employees. Certainly that is something that this committee should continue to reevaluate. However, I do have serious concerns with this legislation. First of all, I believe this legislation is duplicative and unnecessary. Current laws allow the heads of agencies to consult with OPM to establish training programs for their supervisors and their managers. If this subcommittee believes there are agencies skirting their obligations to properly train their employees, it is our responsibility to investigate this matter and not to pass inflexible government-wide mandates. At a time when American families are tightening their budgets, I cannot support a measure that requires federal entities to do something they should have already been doing at an increased cost to the taxpayers. Secondly, I believe this legislation speaks to a larger concern that I and many of my fellow Americans have about our bloated federal bureaucracy. Namely, far too many individuals get placed into positions they are not qualified for, and it is next to impossible to remove them despite a history of poor performance. Instead of giving supervisors expedited authority to fire employees who are not performing their jobs, H.R. 5522 provides them with training on how to effectively manage employees with, quote, and I quote, unacceptable performance, end quote. Mr. Chairman, our country continues to face nearly double-digit employment rates. The federal government has hired nearly 250,000 new employees since December of 2007, while the private sector has lost nearly 8 million jobs in the same period. We should be discussing ways to make agencies operate more efficiently and more effectively while reducing costs and waste. I just happen to believe that H.R. 5522, as it's presently constructed, does not accomplish this goal, and therefore I am going to be voting against this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a co-sponsor of this bill with you, and I must say I appreciate your initiative on this bill. People rise through the ranks in private industry as well as in government based on competence. They may or may not have managed employees. Sometimes they have managed employees, but far fewer than the numbers they will come to manage. The very first entity that ought to be about training managers is the federal government. We cannot complain about inefficiency in the federal government and then explain and then expect that management ability was born into somebody's competence. Yes, they are competent. With a little management training, that competence can be applied. The competence that gets them promoted up the ranks, which is a laudatory way for federal employees as well as private sector employees to rise, can be grasped and put to good use. Management is something of a different skill. It is not an inborn skill. You may be an extraordinary scientist. You may be an extraordinary doctor, but you do not necessarily have all of the tools that it takes to manage other doctors or other scientists. Now, if you're competent enough to go through the ranks, that's just the person we'd want to give some modicum of training. We don't know why agencies don't do this. We do know that it is very difficult to insist upon efficiency in government and not give managers the same tools to provide that efficiency that they would get if they were doing comparable jobs in the private sector. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for this bill and believe, if anything, the bill is overdue. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady. I would just point out, well, we don't have any more speakers, but just point out that I think if this were the private sector, and I agree with his point, that we would assume that this would automatically happen and it would not be required that anyone would mandate that training of supervisors would occur. The difference being that in the private sector it's usually profit. The measure is profit, so that profitability is the goal. Unfortunately, and so that would provide the incentive, I think, for the training. I don't know of any company, successful company in America today, that does not have training for their supervisors, for their leadership, and it's all based on a profit-driven model, which works very successfully. However, in government, we're providing a service. It's not measured in profit. It's measured in efficiency, and not very well at that. And so that's why I think that Mr. Wolf and Mr. Moran and Mr. Conley and the other sponsors of this are, I think, properly focused on providing management training for new employees. I don't know how else they're supposed to get managerial skills if we don't teach it. It's counterintuitive that someone would just begin to manage without having any exposure at all to management skills. So,
will the gentleman yield?
I absolutely yield. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, my point is that current law allows heads of agencies to consult with the Office of Personnel Management and establish training programs. I'm in favor of training programs. I have no problem with training programs. But I think this is somewhat duplicative of what is currently allowed under the law. And we may disagree on that, but I think we can agree that, yes, training is appropriate. Profit, nonprofit, government agencies. I'm not opposed to training per se. I'm just saying that I believe that the way 5522 is structured, it's duplicative, it's not necessary, and that's my point. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to ask for a voice vote on H.R. 5522. Oh, there are no amendments, yeah. I'm not sure. Do any members have any amendments to H.R. 5522? Hearing none. I'm sorry. Does the gentleman from Illinois, was he wish to be heard on this?
No, I'm fine, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you. If no other members wish to speak, I now call up H.R. 5522. The clerk will please read the title of the bill.
H.R. 5522, a bill to amend Chapter 41 of Title V United States Code to provide for the establishment and authorization of funding for certain training programs for supervisors of federal employees.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and without objection so ordered. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If no members wish to offer an amendment, I now move that the Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service in the District of Columbia report H.R. 5522 to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform with the recommendation that the bill does pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5522 to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. All those in favor will now signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5522 is ordered reported to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform.
You've got to give me an A for enthusiasm.
It was good. It was good. You were close. You were close. The next measure being considered is H.R. 5702, a bill that amends the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to reduce the waiting period for holding special elections to fill vacancies in the membership of the Council of the District of Columbia. The bill now before us was introduced by Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton on July 1st, 2010, and is a fairly straightforward and simple piece of legislation. In short, H.R. 5702 reduces the time that a vacant seat will be left open in the District of Columbia Council by 44 days. Under current law, the D.C. Board of Elections and Ethics must hold a special election to fill a vacancy on the Council within 114 days after that vacancy occurs. Due to the stipulation in the Home Rule Act, which is a federal statute, there have been periods in the history of the Council where district residents remained unrepresented for nearly 4 months at a time. Therefore, legislation was introduced and passed by the Council to shorten the time period from 114 days to 70 days. This bill, if passed, would ensure more continuous representation for the citizens of the district who already do not have full-scale Democratic representation. For that purpose, I support the gentlelady and her legislation, and I urge swift adoption by the subcommittee. I now yield to the ranking member for any opening comments that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5702 simply amends the District of Columbia Home Rule Act in order to reduce the waiting period for holding special elections to fill vacancies in the memberships of the Council of the District of Columbia. The bill shortens the time period from the special election to be held from 114 days to 70 days. I'd like to thank Representative Norton for her leadership in helping to bring this legislation before us. I want to note for the record my strong support of her action in this, that we can work together on things on things like this. And I see no reason to stand in the way of this. It seems like a simple, easy, reasonable thing to do, and I wholeheartedly support it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair now recognizes the lead sponsor of this measure, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton of the District of Columbia.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for quickly bringing this matter forward, and may I associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and hope that it means that he will broaden the scope of those matters with which we can disagree, with which we can agree. I certainly am open. This is for the Congress an entirely inconsequential matter, but you can imagine what it would be for a resident of the district who lost, for whatever reason, a council member and was left for months with no representation on the council while important legislation was being passed. So this is a bill really at the request of the local council. I do hope, Mr. Chairman, that a bill for charter reform, so that you, the ranking member, and the subcommittee and Congress will not have to be bothered with matters of this kind which couldn't possibly be of national interest. I hope that that matter will be before us in the coming months. The District of Columbia appears to simply cut in half the number of days and said, let's shorten the time from 114 to 70 days to avoid extended periods of time without local representation. The residents of the District of Columbia have spent 200 years without congressional representation, at least voting representation. So I was quick to say, as you have just said, Mr. Chairman, whatever representation we can get on, let's be quick to do it. And I appreciate how quickly you have come forward and skillfully you have handled this and other matters before this committee. Thank you very much.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I just want Mr. Shavitz to know that he and I think a great deal alike on this issue, and I'm in strong support of it and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. If no other members wish to speak, I now call up H.R. 5702. The clerk will read the title of the bill.
H.R. 5702, a bill to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to reduce the waiting period for holding special elections to fill vacancies in the membership of the Council of the District of Columbia.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment. This process at any point without objection is so ordered. Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If no member wishes to offer an amendment, I now move that the Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service, and the District of Columbia report H.R. 5702 to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform with a recommendation that the bill does pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5702 to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5702 is ordered reported to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Yeah, that was good. We will now move to H.R. 5746, the United States Postal Service's CSRS Obligations Modification Act of 2010. H.R. 5746, a bill that I introduced and is currently sponsored by Representatives Norton, Davis, Kucinich, Clay, and Conley, is intended to remedy an unfair and inequitable methodology for allocating the Postal Service's share of civil service retirement benefit liability for employees that provided service to this country under both the old Post Office Department and the current independent United States Postal Service. According to a January 2010 report by the United States Postal Service's Office of the Inspector General, the Postal Service paid more into the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Trust Fund than it would have paid if a more equitable methodology were used to allocate CSRS, which is Civil Service Retirement System, benefit liabilities between the federal government and the United States Postal Service. As a result of the Postal Service OIG Office of the Inspector General report findings, the Postmaster General of the United States submitted a request in accordance with Section 802C of the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act to the Postal Regulatory Commission, calling for an independent and objective review of the methods used to allocate benefit liabilities between the old Postal Service Department and the federal government under generally accepted actuarial practices and principles. The independent actuarial firm hired by the PRC, the Postal Regulatory Commission, was the Siegel Company, and it determined that the current methodology used by the Office of Personnel Management for allocating such retirement benefits between the United States Postal Service and the federal government follows an antiquated methodology that fails to incorporate current actuarial best practices and accounting standards as recognized and codified by the Financial Accounting Standards Board. Accordingly, to remedy this unjust treatment, H.R. 5746 directs the Office of Personnel Management to update and modernize the actuarial methodology to be used in allocating civil service retirement system benefit liabilities between the Postal Service and the federal government in accordance with the Siegel Company's recommendations. Under this approach, the federal government's portion of an individual civil service retirement annuity will be based on the Civil Service Retirement Benefit Accrual Formula and the conventional benefit accrual formula, in the conventional individual's high 3 average salary. By utilizing this methodology, this legislation will ensure that OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, is using modern actuarial practices and accounting standards codified by the Independent Financial Accounting Standards Board under FASB ASC 715 to apportion the benefit liabilities. Lastly, I'd like to mention that this bill is a matter of fairness and equity rather than a remedy to the Postal Service's current financial woes. I think we all recognize that in addition to H.R. 5746, there may be a series of Postal Service-related legislative measures that this Congress and the next will have to deal with. But at the moment, I'm happy that in this bill we are taking an important step forward, legislating a more equitable share in the pension obligation for those workers who served nobly under both the United States Postal Service and the federal government's Postal Department. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting and fine-tuning H.R. 5746, and with that I now yield to the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The heart of my concern is the swift nature in which we're trying to move this forward. There is great confusion among the CRS, the CBO. We have had this bill for literally, we can count days or hours in which this has been reviewed. And while that may be appropriate for some bills at some times that are of somewhat inconsequential, this has big consequences. It has not been properly studied, and that's the heart of my concern. H.R. 5746 would reverse a decision made by this Congress in 1974 to make the Postal Service responsible for pension obligations incurred as a result of salary increases granted by the Postal Service. Reversing this almost 40-year-old decision would create, on paper at least, an overpayment of roughly $55 billion. And while this overpayment was largely funded decades ago and has not contributed to the Postal Service's current financial difficulties, this bill would apply the overpayment as a credit against the Postal Service's future obligations to pre-fund postal retirees' health benefits. This bill is perhaps accounting gamesmanship that does nothing to necessarily solve the Postal Service's short-term fiscal deficits, does nothing to encourage necessary structural reforms of the Postal Service, and puts future taxpayers on the hook for funding postal retirees' health benefits a decade from now. Before we are asked to vote on this bill, I'd ask the Chairman and the majority whether they intend to move separate legislation this year to deal with the Postal Service's short-term fiscal deficits. Before we commit $55 billion of the taxpayers' funds to postal retiree health benefits a decade from now, we should know whether the majority intends to waive or reduce the Postal Service's obligation to pay $5.5 billion on September 30th for postal retiree health benefits. By promising to credit the Postal Service $55 billion in 10 years, we would greatly reduce the incentive for the Postal Service to begin making necessary structural reforms. We know the Postal Service's current costs are unsustainable and that 80% of the Postal Service's costs are personnel costs. Until the Postal Service makes headway in controlling these costs, the Postal Service will continue to be in financial crisis. I'm concerned that this 10-year delay in applying the $55 billion credit appears to be a deliberate attempt to avoid the pay-as-you-go or pay-go budget rules. Given the massive deficits we are currently incurring, I do not believe we should avoid pay-go. I believe we should be following pay-go budgeting rules. Altering the responsibility to fund postal retiree obligations between the Postal Service and the U.S. Treasury is a zero-sum game. Any reduction in the Postal Service's liability must necessarily be made up in full by taxpayers. And finally, the bill would give the federal agency, OPM, wide latitude and discretion over how and when it commits $55 billion of taxpayer funds. It is inappropriate given this much to give this much discretion solely to the federal agency. The Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse, and it is irresponsible to delegate a $55 billion decision to a federal agency. It is my understanding that we do not even have guidance from OPM over how and when they would apply the $55 billion credit, and I find this unacceptable. I think what is warranted at this time is to have a hearing on this matter. It's a serious matter. We're dealing with billions and billions of dollars. There are unintended consequences and things that in such a short amount of time have not been fully explored. As we all know, the Postal Service is facing serious financial crisis. Over the next several fiscal years, it is projecting $7 billion in deficits. A bloated workforce, the economic recession, increased use of electronic tools for communicating have all contributed to the United States Postal Service's current situation. And I'm committed to working with you and others to address these issues in a fiscally responsible manner. However, I simply have hesitancy about this bill and its ability to solve the fiscal matters before us. Again, I would ask for a hearing and for a further understanding and a unification on what the numbers truly are before we move forward, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for introducing this legislation. As I reviewed it and as I looked at it and thought about it, I sort of felt myself thinking, if there's a fire, do you just stand still or do you move around a little bit with the hope that maybe something that you're doing will avoid some of the smoke from getting in your eye? I know that you mentioned that this legislation is designed to create fairness and equity and not as any remedy for the financial and fiscal problems that the Postal Service face. With your indulgence, I'd just like to ask, do you feel that it would put the Postal Service in perhaps a different position than it would find itself if we did not pass the legislation?
Well, addressing the gentleman's question, we've got several estimates of how much this might benefit the Postal Service. I think on the low end, the difference is $55 billion, and on the high end it was $75 billion. So that would substantially impact the Postal Service's position and allow them some time, I think, to deal with some of the longer-term problems that we have. It won't solve everything, but it will certainly, and these are discussions that I had with Postmaster General Potter, it would be a significant improvement in his mind if we could clear up this discrepancy.
Thank you very much. I mean, I would agree that it certainly will not solve all of the problems, but if I was given my druthers, I'd rather have $55 billion than no billion, and I'd even rather have 75 than 55. So I think it's a good piece of legislation. It represents an effort on your part to try and think through our crisis and move us in the direction of some solution. So I commend you for introducing this legislation. I urge its support and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, especially from the standpoint is for many years he was the chairman of this subcommittee, so I really appreciate those remarks. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding. And thank you for bringing the bill forward, too, Mr. Chairman. You know, to me, this bill will remedy what I consider to be an unfair, untenable situation as far as the accounting methodology that impacts the U.S. Postal Service, having been under this arcane system since 1971. It has really put them at an economic disadvantage, and I see this bill as doing a justice to the U.S. Postal Service, to its employees, as well as to the American ratepayers. It corrects a injustice that has existed for almost 40 years, and it's time that we do it. I appreciate you coming up with this unique method of correcting what is a wrong, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for coming forward with this much needed, I think the word for it is correction. There is no case to be made for using antiquated methodologies that were apparently used at the time that the federal government gave up control of the post office. And what is that, 40 years? Well, the federal government, which struggles with two different retirement systems because of the changeover, has somehow managed to change its own system, which was apparently the same as the post office system then. But the post office has been left with a system that requires it to overpay into its old retirement system. It's hard to the only question I have is, why did we let it hang out there for so long? The Congress probably should have acted on this decades ago. It's a highly technical matter. I can understand the concern of the ranking member, but precisely the complexity of the matter argues for giving this issue to the OPM so that they can do notice and comment, and so they can make the decision, given the amount of money that is involved, as to how to, in fact, transfer this surplus. This is a classic administrative agency problem. There's no way in which, if we gave ourselves another year, we should fine-tune what a technical issue that should be left to the expert agency, which already deals with two different retirement systems for a very long time on the federal side, and now has to decide what to do with the post office, who was in a similar position but now has been left back in the last century. So I think it's just the right thing to do to correct it, to leave to the expert agency how to correct it, and to get it to get the authorization to correct it done, and to bring the post office into the same kind of equitable circumstance that federal employees long ago traveled to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I won't be that long. I simply support this legislation. I think it's very important, and I think that it's a matter of fairness, and it's simply the right thing to do. The idea that there have been overpayments, and that there is this, I see this as more or less correcting some things that have not been done properly in the past. And it's clear that without doing what we're doing here today, we put a lot of jobs and service in jeopardy, and we simply cannot afford that. And so, again, I applaud you, and I look forward to voting for the bill. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All those who dedicated their life of service to the Post Office Department or the Postal Service should know that this subcommittee stands solidly behind a formula which will achieve an equitable an equitable solution to the questions relating to the allocation formula. So I think that the chair has achieved that, and the methodology that you've determined would be the most fair approach to use is one that I think has been thought through, and that it deserves support, and I do support it. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent to be recorded in the affirmative in the previous votes.
Without objection.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, Congressman Moran, Wolf, and I recently introduced bipartisan legislation to strengthen the training of federal managers. This bill, H.R. 5522, has the support of the Senior Executives Association and the Federal Managers Association. I know from experience in the private sector that high-performing employees don't necessarily understand how to be good managers when they're promoted to positions of managerial responsibility. Frequently, even in the private sector, we'll take a good scientist or a good engineer, or even in the school system a good teacher, and we'll promote them into management. At any rate, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask the balance of my remarks be entered into the record at this point on that bill.
Absolutely, and I know the gentleman worked very hard on that issue, and I commend him for his great work. And if he would like to offer his remarks for the record, we would receive them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are now talking about the H.R. 5746. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
That is correct.
And I thank the Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the opportunity to mark up this bill, which provides breathing room to the Postal Service and averts the need to make painful cuts that could result in long-term degradation of service and loss of customers. It may also prevent the Postal Service from exceeding its statutory debt limit. Most importantly, the bill ensures that the Postal Service's CSRS payments are calculated in accordance with industry best practices. The methodology outlined in the bill is consistent with standards established by the Independent Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB. And I appreciate the Chairman's diligent work to address this inequity and urge my colleagues to support this. We've had a lot of testimony in this committee about this issue, and it's one that frankly impedes the ability of the Postal Service to move forward and become competitive. It is the largest single improvement we in Congress at this moment can make to help restore the balance in the Postal Service. It's a requirement we don't impose on other entities, but we do on the Postal Service. And it really bites into their competitive advantage. So I think it's something we can do that makes a difference. We've heard from the Postmaster General, we've heard from employee groups, we've heard from the Postal Regulatory Commission. All of them on this one are in agreement that we need to correct this inequity. I would also point out, Mr. Chairman, that some of our colleagues are going to object, saying that this is a budget buster. But frankly, this isn't a net new cost necessarily. This isn't a new cost item. It's already being paid. It is a question of how it's scored, a technical budget issue, but at the end of the day, it's not going to cost taxpayers any new money. I think this is the right thing to do to help restore the Postal Service to a competitive position, and I think it's long overdue, and it has my full support, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for bringing it up before us today.
I thank the gentleman. Let me just, I'll give myself 5 minutes just to address a couple of the points raised by the distinguished ranking member, and I appreciate his concern. This issue rather, is not new. It may seem new, but it was first raised by the Postal Service's Office of the Inspector General back in January of 2010. So we've been dealing with this since that time, so about 6 months, and that might seem fast because of the rate at which everything else in this body moves. But so we've had a chance now for 6 months to have some studies done, and we have weighed several approaches here. So we are trying to do this in a very thoughtful and deliberate way. The bill doesn't dictate to the Office of Personnel Management how to transfer any surplus, and really this is an open process, and this is something where I'm hoping for bipartisanship on how we get to the end result, which is to provide fairness between the ratepayer and the taxpayer, and also with respect to the federal government and the United States Postal Service. I am not saying this bill is perfect, laying it out here. It's the best accommodation of all the ideas that I've seen out there. I think it's a positive first step, a good starting point, and I think it addresses the specific issue at hand. The bill is sound in its current form, and the only possible changes that might occur at this point would be those related to any pending Congressional Budget Office comments. In terms of the timing of this, our feedback that we've gotten from the Congressional Budget Office on scoring is, and also, CBO would not score a hypothetical. So we needed a bill out there with a reasonable approach so that then, under their mandate, the Congressional Budget Office could measure what the cost could be. Now, and right now, that's why I gave a range of $55 billion to $75 billion. That's a pretty wide range. So nothing is etched in stone here. The CBO also indicated that they needed additional time because of the complexity of this to discuss provisions of the bill and gather additional information from the Office of Personnel Management and the Postal Service. They've told us that preliminarily they can see what the bill is trying to do, but they want to make sure they aren't missing anything so that whenever we make a final decision on a final version here, we will have confidence that their numbers are valid. In responding to the concerns of shifting a burden from the taxpayer to the ratepayer, in many cases the same person, I think it's important to point out that the individuals whose pensions we are talking about were, in fact, they were federal workers for the Postal Department, and they provided those services as federal employees, so that I think it's proper that they should, their pensions that vested during that time should be paid by the federal government and not by the ratepayers. That's a shifting of a burden that I think is very damaging to the current financial situation of the Postal Service. And also, again, I want to clarify something with respect to those numbers that I put out there. Those are very soft numbers. Those aren't hard numbers. And that could shift over time. It could be at the high end, it could be at the low end. But we just want a sound and thoughtful and as accurate as possible estimate of what we're really talking about for this calculation. And with respect to a hearing, we did actually have a hearing on this back in April. We had a joint hearing with the full committee. So we have not brought this forward without a hearing. I would never do something like that on something of this importance. And I want to yield now to the ranking. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Bill Bray, the gentleman from California, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say, as member down at this end, I want to thank you for having a bill that is 5 pages. This is so refreshing to be able to have the ability to not only read it, but actually discuss it and be able to actually know exactly what actions were taken and be able to contemplate that. And frankly, I'm really happy to hear that we're not talking about a comprehensive approach to this issue. We're talking about let's do what we can, where we can, when we think it's appropriate, and move through this process as we can. And we may have to change the strategy. So I have some real concerns with this legislation, but I have a great appreciation for the means in which you've approached it, how we've gone after this. I think there is concerns here about how much is the taxpayer bearing on this or taking with this legislation. But then again, there's how fair is it for the ratepayer to be burdened with an obligation that wasn't directly related to the service being provided by the Postal Service to that ratepayer. So I have concerns, and I think they're legitimate concerns that both sides have raised on this, but frankly, I am more comfortable with the ratepayer paying their fair share. I think the biggest concerns that you probably have with the ranking member is the fact that when we don't know how the taxpayer is ever going to pay their fair share, the way that the budget is exploding. So I just have to tell you, frankly, I appreciate the fact that it's 5 pages. You didn't try to do big, huge item. I don't have to go through and ask staff to spend, try to find what's in it after we vote. And I do appreciate that. And I have concerns about this. I just want to clarify with staff, do I have a conflict on this item because I have a family member on the commission? Does anybody know if that's a conflict under our laws?
Well,
And on
good
clarification, it
question.
may not count as a family member because he's a member of the Democratic Party, okay?
oh, okay. There's one of those in every family.
Yes, I know it. Actually, I'm one of those.
If you're in
our
trouble, I've got, I think at last count, 17 members of my family, extended families and in-laws and cousins that work for the post office, so if you're in trouble, I am as well. Why don't we ask staff to look that up?
I'm just saying that this is the policy, the recommendation is actually being made by my first cousin. I think some of you have served with Jim, but
right.
just make sure that it doesn't appear like I'm not declaring my affiliation with one of these recommendations. So I will yield to the ranking member if there's any time left.
Sure there is. And we note the concern on conflict that you've raised.
Thank you. Part of the concern here is the fact that this bill was introduced, I believe, last Thursday, substitute less than 24 hours ago. We did have a hearing a number of months ago. I do think the impact of this, it warrants a bit more time before we simply pass it off to the full committee. I concur with the obligation to be thoughtful and deliberate in our actions. I compliment the chairman for taking on a complex issue and not just punting it down the road. This should have been probably dealt with a while ago. But here are some of the words and some of the things I heard in these discussions. Unique, it's highly technical, it's complex, 55 billion, 75 billion. There is so much that we still need to learn about what's going to happen or not going to happen. And this is not simply just, oh, we're going to just erase it and the 55 billion goes away. No. You're going to change that obligation from one set of people to another set of people. Now, I recognize and concur with the idea that we have to address this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we do nothing, but I'm suggesting that, yeah, there's some things that we need to further explore, like if there's such urgency, then why are we punting this 10 years down the road? Oh, that just coincidentally puts us outside the rules, outside the scope of PAYGO. Oh, okay, well, that's convenient. So, you know, there are little things like that that I think we all deserve to have explored before we simply shift things from one piece of paper to another piece of paper. It is a good starting point. Again, I commend the chairman and the staff and others that are working hard and diligently on this. You know it's somewhat problematic when you have CRS and CBO both say, we're not totally sure here yet. And I guess that's my point. And I think that we as a subcommittee have the obligation to ferret these details out rather than just keep pushing it down the road. You just don't keep pushing it. No, that's what our job is in this subcommittee. Nobody in this Congress will give it more time and attention than the members sitting on this dais right now. So let's not just say, oh, okay, yes, without truly understanding what is going to happen. And I think we will gain credibility as a subcommittee and as a Congress by fully understanding and have this fully vetted out before we simply pass it up to the full committee. Let's have it mean something other than, oh, okay, well, you know, it's important. Okay, well, yeah, it's important, but let's understand the details of it. That's my point, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And I don't necessarily disagree that, you know, the best work could be handled in this committee in vetting this and crunching the numbers and all that, but that's not going to happen during the month of August. It is not. And what I'm trying to do here is to make use of the time for the Congressional Budget Office and CSRS and the Postal Service to crunch these numbers, boil it down. There are competing interests there, so I think they will work out. It's an adversarial system, so I think they will work out something that, and they'll make their cases. You'll hear CSRS, the Civil Service Retirement System, say one thing. You'll hear the Postal Service say another thing. The Office of the Inspector General, the independent accounting firms, they will drill down and we'll be able to use the data and the process that they will go through during the month of August so that when we come back in September, we'll be able to grapple with this. And we'll have much better information. And I'll tell you, just as they have said we're not so sure, I'm not so sure. And that's what I'm trying to get at. We need more information. We need CBO to come in with that assessment on what we are really talking about and how this might score, because in order to move this thing any further in the process, we're going to need that very important information. Lastly, I would just say that this is a problem that began back in 1971, and folks have been kicking this thing down the road for a long time now, and I just think it's, you know, we can't continue to do this. It's going to blow up. It's sort of like some of our budgetary problems on the overall government budget. We continue to just kick these things down the road, and now they're catching up with us. So what I'm hoping is that we'll definitively deal with this. We'll try to keep it in a, you know, a concise, understandable form so people understand what's going on. And it's going to be a tough decision either way. There will be no important, there will be no easy outs here. It's going to be a tough decision, but we'll make it with, it will be an informed decision based on what the CBO comes back with, the Congressional Budget Office comes back to us with, and we'll be able to, at the end of the day, say we're doing the best thing for the American people. Does the gentleman from Virginia seek time?
I was going to ask if the chairman would yield for a question.
Oh, yeah. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, does majority staff remember how many hearings this subcommittee has had on the plight of the Postal Service in this Congress?
It would be a guess, but 5 or 6, I think.
At least 5 or 6 I've attended. And, Mr. Chairman, is it not true that at every one of those hearings, this issue has actually been a prominent issue in testimony and in questioning?
In some respect, yeah. In one form or another, yes.
And, Mr. Chairman, is it not true that both the Postmaster General and the head of the National Regulatory Commission, Ms. Galloway, and others have testified that key to any solution, fiscal solution for the financial woes of the Postal Service, this piece is essential?
Oh, yeah. Words to that effect, yes.
And, Mr. Chairman, finally, is it not true that in all of those hearings, what has been pressed upon this committee is the urgency and immediacy of the issue, that we can't continue to dither and do nothing, otherwise the situation continues to deteriorate? Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
That is.
And as the chairman has noted already, if we're going to get a bill scored by the Congressional Budget Office, because of the arcane nature of that process, we have to have a bill to be scored. And that means this subcommittee has to report something out, hopefully something meaningful, and I think this bill is, that gives the CBO something to score. Mr. Chairman, in light of the answers to those questions you've given, I will support the motion to report out a bill.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Does anyone wish to seek time?
Will Chairman yield to one question? This doesn't take effect till 2021, is that correct?
Actually, the reconciliation would begin. That's what we're trying to find out from CBO, is when the reconciliation would actually begin between the differences in the two funds and how they might accomplish that. Conceivably, or theoretically at least, there are some who we have consulted who said that this may be accomplished without a scoring impact. Now, so, you know, if it can be done without a scoring impact, it can just happen. It can just happen. And so that's one of the things we're trying to drill down, because I agree, you've raised a valid concern that on the House floor, the scoring issue will be paramount for many, many members on your side of the aisle and mine. And we're just trying to give them a clear picture of how this is going to happen. We need CBO's imprimatur of legitimacy on the issue, and that's why we're trying to work this bill through the process. You know I have a lot of members on my side who don't know how they're going to vote on this issue until they have all the information. So this is not a this is not a cinch. This is not something that's been previously determined. This is something that is really open to question on your side as well as ours. I know that from a technical standpoint, to answer your question, the bill would go into effect immediately. there's 6 months for a recalculation, and then 90 days after that for regulations on transfer, which would be how much of the allocation and funding would be shifted over what period of time. So, but the bill would go into effect immediately. Any other members wish to be heard on this? Okay. If no other members wish to be heard, I now call up H.R. 5746. The clerk will please read the title of the bill.
H.R. 5746, a bill to amend the provisions of Title V United States Code relating to the methodology for calculating the amount of any postal surplus or supplemental liability under the Civil Service Retirement System.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read, and I now open this process for amendment without objection. So ordered. I believe I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5746, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as original text. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. This amendment I'm offering makes a number of minor changes based on feedback that we've received from various stakeholders. First, the amendment clarifies that the reallocation of CSRS, Civil Service Retirement System, benefit liabilities applies to benefits already paid, as well as benefits to be paid in the future. Secondly, the amendment ensures that Civil Service Retirement System benefits paid to postal law enforcement officers, such as postal inspectors, are included in the provision of this bill. Thirdly, the amendment makes clear that the bill does not affect the Civil Service Retirement System benefits paid to individuals. And fourth, the amendment clarifies the bill that this bill does not affect the retiree health benefit amortization payments due between 2017 and 2020. And lastly, the amendment makes some other corrections based on technical comments received from the Office of Personnel Management. I hope all members will join me in supporting this amendment, and I now yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes for any comments that he may have on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I don't want to exhaust this too much, but to my point, this bill was introduced on Thursday. We already have a substitute. We've had this less than 24 hours, and we're talking about something that was in just those few days. Not much probably happened over the weekend, right? In just those few days, bumped it back 5 years. The point is, we need to be responsible in taking our time and understand that's a huge implication, has huge implications. I just feel like we have not properly vetted this thing. I've made that point. I appreciate the indulgence of my other people on this committee. I want to do something. I applaud you for bringing this up, but again, we need to fully understand this, and to have this substitute less than 24 hours and be voting on it, I just will have to vote no. Yield back.
I certainly respect the gentleman, and I understand his point. However, we don't have anything to vet unless we get the assessment from the Congressional Budget Office as what this is going to cost, what the impact is going to be on the taxpayer, what the impact is going to be on the ratepayer. Then we can vet. This is an open process. I commit to an open process here. Like I said, if we get the wrong answers here from CBO, there'll be a lot of folks on my side voting no, and maybe even myself. So we're asking to get this information, and then give us the ability, based on the numbers that they bring back, give us the ability to actually vet it. Let us crunch the numbers. Let us figure out what the impact will be. I think it'll be a much more informed decision if we can make it with the information that the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Personnel Management and the Postal Service can provide. And that's what this this is really a starting point. I don't want the gentleman to think this is the end. This is really a starting point, but I think we have to move forward. This is a very, very serious issue. A lot of pensioners out there and workers, this means a great deal to them. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? If no other members wish to speak on the amendment, the question is now on the Lynch amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor would please indicate by saying aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. You need a roll call on this or no?
No,
Okay.
now we need to do the full bill. That was just on the subject.
Are there any further amendments? Since no members wish to offer further amendments, I now move that the Subcommittee on the Federal Workforce, Postal Service, and the District of Columbia report H.R. 5746 as amended to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform with the recommendation that the bill does pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5746 to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote having been requested, the clerk will now please read the roll.
Mr. Lynch.
Aye.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes aye. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes aye. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes aye. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Gao? Mr. Schuster?
The clerk will now please report the roll.
On that, the ayes are 8, the noes are 1.
The ayes have it, and H.R. 5746 is ordered reported to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. This concludes our business for the day. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any technical and conforming changes to all matters ordered reported. Without objection so ordered, this committee now stands adjourned.